And we are live. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Simply Spooky. I hope you've all had a good week. I think I've had quite a good week. It seems to be going well for me at the moment, so let's hope I can keep it that way. So it's Wednesday night, and we've got a special guest in tonight. We've got Mr. Brian Hoggard. And would you like to explain to us a little bit about who you are and what you do, please, Brian?
Okie dokie. Well, I'm an author, as well as other things that I do during the daytime. But yeah, years and years ago, in the late 1990s, I was studying the history of witchcraft. But I also have been an amateur archaeologist for some years, and so I was aware of the work of someone called Ralph Merrifield, who'd written a book called The Archaeology of Ritual and Magic. And there are two chapters in that book that deal with the 16th and 17th centuries and sort of objects that were found in buildings. And it really piqued my interest. I became really fascinated by those objects. And also I became really aware that actually there was a huge amount of work could be done on those objects to find out how widespread those practices were and, just to find more examples, really learn more about them. Because Ralph Merrifield's book is excellent, but it covers thousands of years of history. And so the period that I was interested in only got sort of a short passage in his book, really. And I thought we could dive into that a bit more. And so that's what I started to do. I started surveying museums and archaeological units, asking them, have you got any of this type of objects? What sort of tales have you got? What sort of objects have you got in your collections? And I began to discover that there's just a vast quantity of this stuff out there. Ralph Merrifield came across quite a bit, almost by accident, and wrote about it. But when I started doing a systematic survey, I was really surprised at how much of it there was out there and the range and variety, and also the spread of time over which it happened. I started off thinking, this is all just 17th century, 18th century type of stuff. But I quickly found out that people were depositing objects like this right up, well into the 20th century, and wow. Some people even today. And also that it spreads all the way across the world, really. And then I wrote my book. So, yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So I'm assuming that some of the stuff that you find would be artifact? Would they be things like mummified cats, that type of thing, or religious iconic things, or that type of thing?
There's more usually in the sort of folk magic sort of realm rather than religious, but there are definitely religious things because people would be quite sort of obvious and quite public about their religious adherence, and if they were trying to protect their homes in a religious way, they weren't scared to show that. But some of these other practices would kind of be frowned upon by the local vicar if they knew it was going on, even though the vicars kind of knew it was going on, but you would sort of keep it. And so, things like witch bottles, concealed shoes, dried cats, occasionally horse skulls, also things like knife blades, broken objects stuffed into cavities in buildings.
So this wouldn't just be specifically churches, this would be other buildings as well?
Yeah, it'd be mainly actually domestic dwellings, domestic buildings, but churches have a lot of it as well, because obviously the same people that were protecting their homes in this way also went to church, and so they would protect the church as well, because although we think of religion and magic as two completely separate things, and in many ways they are, in the distant past, people had, it was all kind of magic to them, really, So they actually saw what was going on in the church as a kind of magic, as well as the kind of magic that they were doing at home. Yeah. But they were aware that there was kind of almost like a political division, and they shouldn't be too obvious about certain things. So yeah.
Yeah, I can see the crossover there, because the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, I bought a book from there, and I was quite surprised at the time to find out that sort of 16th, 17th century, the witchcraft, that a lot of it was, these were also deeply religious people. So they had fundamentally they were sort of Christian, but they used witchcraft as an arm of it, I guess, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at some of the charms that cunning folk used to write for people to protect their farms and things like that, you've got, they're very wordy, so it's all words on a page. So you've got basically a huge run of invocations to Jesus to protect the farmer and all the livestock and all the property on the farm from evil and witches and wizards and things like that. But at the same time, you've got astrological symbols on these charms. Right. You've got abracadabra word triangles. You've got depictions from the sort of Key of Solomon, things like that was in fairly wide circulation once upon a time. And so people are like taking supernatural power from all sources that they can, really. to try and bring it all together to help protect someone. And they don't really see any problem mixing up these forms of magic, one of which is Christianity.
Yeah, yeah. So these artifacts, and I mean, I'm looking at things like witch marks as well that you find in buildings. Like some of them are really ornate, aren't they? The design of them is fantastic. So would that be as a kind of a witchcraft Christian sort of layover to protect yourselves, protect your property and what have you against other witches or witchcraft in general, or just magic in general?
Well, the term witch marks is a little bit problematic because it kind of like takes all of the different marks that we see and sort of puts them all into one kind of category. But
Right.
actually, there's lots of different stories behind the different types of marks. So
Okay.
the ones that you have quite often people would draw circles, just really simple circles. And to me, that's like the earliest symbol for the sun that there is. Yep. And that's
Okay.
basically bringing light to an area so that darkness can't lurk there. But as we go through the sort of later medieval period, that idea of the circle, it took on the folklore that witches hate circles because there are no corners for people to hide in. Right. But actually, it comes from a much more ancient practice of solar symbols, bringing light into places to dispel darkness. And then you get these overlapping circles where circles are joined together and overlapping in to create sort of daisy wheel patterns and hexafoils and things like that.
Yeah.
And those are also a very ancient symbol. Some of the earliest ones of those date from about 1600 BC in the Mediterranean and Egypt.
Wow.
But there's a continuous use of that symbol right up until certainly the 19th century in this country. But I think in this country, people kind of forgot what the meaning of it was for a while.
Right.
It became like a graffiti symbol rather than like in some places you find that symbol very much integrated into design or painted as a symbol. But later on in this country, especially, you end up with lots of little graffiti versions of it. So it becomes like a folklore protection symbol.
Yeah.
And that one's got nothing to do with Christianity, but also it has nothing really to do with what we would now consider to be witchcraft. It's more like an ancient symbol that means something that's become adapted and used by various groups for different things. And then we also get the VVs, the overlapping Vs, and the Ms with a little tapering leg.
Yes.
And those are invocations to the Virgin Mary. Okay, so that's Virgin Mary was a nurturing, protective figure, and people thought they could invoke her presence to protect a place from evil. And so that's what that's all about. And you sometimes also get an eye with a cross through the middle, and that's a symbol for Christ. So that's the old way of like doing J for Yezu or Jesus.
Yeah.
And you get those quite a lot. We also get sort of things that are a bit more symbolic, a bit more crude, well, not crude, I suppose, but a bit more basic, I suppose, a bit less, perhaps a bit less ancient, but you get these kind of grids that are scratched onto things, and we refer to those as mesh marks, and it's like a symbolic fence, if you like, or net to prevent evil from going into that area. And then on timbers, we also get burn marks, deliberate burn marks, and these are where you deliberately singe away the surface of the wood. You have to create a kind of teardrop flame-shaped mark. And on oak, for example, or ancient timbers, what happens is that a carbon layer forms so that you can't burn it anymore unless you scrape it, and then it can carry on burning. And so some of these burn marks end up being really quite deep. You can fit your thumb inside them.
Right.
And there's no way they could happen by accident. And to my mind, what's happening there is that where the surface is being decayed away by the flame, you end up with almost like a ghost of a flame. So again, like the circle is bringing light to an area to dispel darkness, these burn marks are providing a kind of symbolic candle flame, if you like, to prevent darkness from lurking in that area as well.
Oh, so it's a representation of light again.
Yeah, to my mind. Yeah, other people have slightly different ideas. Some people think it's all to do with Candlemas and the way people treated candles as specifically sacred at certain times of year. And it's a valid interpretation, but to me, the idea of the light resonates with the other ideas that seem to be apparent in what other people do. So
I've seen one of those multi-circle ones on the back of a farm door. The farm itself was about 600 years old, and it had one of those sort of multi-circle marks on it. Quite big. It was very big actually. And a friend of mine had a house in an old cottage in Essex. It was getting on. The building itself was getting on for 1,000 years old, and he was cleaning the chimney out, and he found what he called 2 witch sticks. They were like a walking stick type things that he found. They were hidden up the chimney, And I mean, I have no idea whether they were witch sticks or what witch sticks even are, but that's what he told me they were. He got them researched or something, and that was the information that came back. But
Well, sometimes in the Victorian era, people used to make what they call witches' canes out of glass, and they'd often have like very fancy sort of twisted patterns going down the stem, and they'd be referred to as witch canes. So that's the thing I would think of if someone said witch sticks or witch.
it might have very well have been that, to be fair. But there was a lot of magic, folk magic around that area. I guess it was everywhere, wasn't it? Sort of 16th, 17th centuries.
I mean, the more you look into it, the more you find it literally everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the Southeast did have the period of the witch trials was kind of a bit more intensified by the likes of Matthew Hopkins, who basically created a bit more panic and a bit more intensity to that whole, and a bit more horror, basically, to the situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, there certainly is a lot of this stuff in the Southeast. But part of that is because in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a very wealthy area because of sheep farming and all that kind of stuff. And they had some really nice, prestigious, well-made buildings that people kept. And those things had these practices going on in them at the time, but because they're so nice, we still have them today because they were really well made. Whereas in some other areas of the country, buildings that were made at that time weren't always that good, and so I mean, obviously there are really good quality buildings in all parts of the world, in all parts of the country, but particularly so in the wealthy kind of wool areas.
Now, I remember reading a book some years ago, and it was about church architecture. And there was a chapter in it that was given over to the green man that you find in churches. And the interpretation that they gave for the presence of the green man in the church, they said that, or the author's idea was that it was there as a sort of a pagan way of sticking your fingers up at the church. That you weren't that happy with the church. So you get these ancient, I suppose, carpenters, craftsmen would secretly, they would work some of those images into the woodwork of the church. But subsequently I found out now that goes back a lot further. The Green Man goes back a lot further than that and isn't initially English, is it? It comes from abroad somewhere. So I don't know the origin of it. But would you know anything about those representations in churches of green men? Or
well, I know there's an awful lot of discussion about the Green Man, and it's, in architectural terms, they refer to it as a foliate head. So it's like a leafy head, basically. And it's kind of weird because when you look at some of the sculptures that people used to do, especially if you look at what they call misericords, which are the images that they used to carve underneath choir stall seats. I don't know if you've ever seen those. But you end up with some like really, really unusual topics, So you end up with like great big dragons and pigs eating humans and, all sorts of strange things. And so in the medieval period, which is huge, obviously a huge period, people would entertain all kinds of like fantastic beasts and stuff in their minds, and images. And so it's not surprising that you get things like the foliate head. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how far back it goes, but certainly this idea of a kind of wild man of the woods and everything certainly permeates ancient Europe.
Yeah.
And that may be where it comes from, But that's something for another scholar. I know a little bit about it, but I wouldn't call myself an expert on the Green Man.
But I think you're right. I think the general consensus of opinion was that it was sort of early Europe it had come from, and we just made its way over here. But it's interesting all the same to think that something like that could travel that far. So what are your most exciting objects that you've worked with that have been found in these buildings or churches, Brian, please?
Well, for me, I mean, because obviously I've got this kind of category of objects that I look at, and I think all of them have had their sort of little peak moments, So basically, where you get a really good example of a witch bottle, for example, I've got a friend who's a doctor of chemistry at Loughborough University. He was a retired research fellow, and so when we find a witch bottle that's sealed, I can sometimes arrange to take it to him, where he'll open it in a laboratory and empty the contents out. And he'll even use sort of devices to kind of sniff the gases that come out of it to determine what compound the gas to determine what might originally have been inside it. And then he'll put it under an electron microscope to find out what every little particle is, And sometimes you find things like fleas and things like that inside. So you'll have a big big lock of hair, lots of bent nails and pins, lots of liquid, which originally was urine.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes you'll have like a little bit of fabric, that kind of thing. So, it's fascinating to see. It's really amazing to see that happen, because those bottles in some cases, would have been concealed, at the earliest around 1660, 1670, that kind of period. They've been sealed since then. And here we are opening them up in a laboratory and looking at what comes out. It's quite amazing to see that. And then I've been on site when people have discovered dried cats in thatches, for example, and there'll be a thatcher busy kind of rethatching a house, comes to a certain layer, and in an old village I used to live in called Eckington in Worcestershire, they found one underneath about 3 layers of thatch. Appears to be 17th century. Clearly was deliberately placed there because it was squashed quite flat within the roof structure, and it just dried out in a very stable environment, But to see one of those, I mean, by the time I got there, it had already been removed from the house and was on a table essentially for me to observe. And it's quite shocking when you first see something like that. And obviously, I mean, I'm a cat lover. I love cats. Would never harm a cat. But to see something like that is quite surprising, And in that case, I did recommend that they put it back in the thatch, which they did. So it's now back exactly where they found it.
Are they put in alive initially? The cats, are they forced to go in there alive and then they die, or was there evidence of scratches, like for it fighting for its life? Or
there are a couple of examples where there is evidence of scratches, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, it seems like when these animals were concealed, they were either, I think a lot of people, I think it varies basically. I think a lot of people would have killed the cat. I don't know how, but they would have killed the cat before putting it in there. But there are some, there's another Worcestershire example that I know of where they found a cat on a beam in between 2 lath and plaster panels. Okay, so you have this big old timber, lath and plaster panels up each side. They took the plaster panel off because they were converting it to become new posh flats for someone or other. And there was a cat just lying on the beam. And they said, the builder that I met, apart from being freaked out when they found it, and there's another element to the story I'll tell you in a second, but all the builders thought it looked very peaceful. It just it looked like it was asleep on this timber, like it had literally just given up fighting or had got bored waiting, and it just was lying on waiting for his end to come. And as they dry out, their hair all falls out, so it's just surrounded by this little ring of hair. And he didn't want to touch it. It was, all the builders at work at that time were very superstitious about it. This is the late 1990s, and but site foreman ordered the guy that I knew called Dave to move it. He really didn't want to, but he picked it up, took it downstairs and put it in the skip, but quite reverently, because he was quite moved by it. And then on his way back upstairs, a freshly installed plaster panel fell off the ceiling and gashed his head open. And he and all the builders were sure that it was the bad luck brought about by moving the cat. And that's what they all believed. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but that's what they all it's just interesting, isn't it, that in a modern context, these people are converting an old 18th
and superstitious. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
So if you getting onto
like
the subject now of sort of the supernatural, have you ever dealt with anything that has led you to believe that it's had supernatural energies attached to it, or have you experienced anything from dealing with these objects, or know anybody that has?
Well, I can tell you that an awful lot of the people who call me up because they've found something in their houses do believe that something has happened as a result of finding it or unsettling it or moving it. Because I don't think anything's happened to me specifically while I've been finding these things, because I'm not the finder. I'm the person that they get in touch with after they've found it. Yeah. And obviously these people, they're living in a house with an object that when they find it, first of all, they're shocked, what on earth is this? Then they get in touch with someone, or they do some research on the internet, or they talk to me and they find out what it's all about. And then they start to think, why were these people who lived in my house so scared that they did this to the building? What was it that was happening to them that made them this scared that they needed to modify their building in some way, or pull this panel off to put this inside the building, or kill this cat, or dig a hole 1.5 foot deep to put a witch bottle upside down underneath their hearthstone, or to find a cat and stick it up in the roof, or something like that. Or to carve these surfaces that you've presumably paid some carpenter a lot of money to make for your house, or to put these marks on there, And basically, I think for most people, in the past, what we now refer to as the supernatural was an absolutely normal part of everyday existence.
Yes.
Yeah.
They basically had a sense of magic all around them all the time.
Yes.
And because there was no science, no medicine, no law, an awful lot of misfortune would be explained by supernatural means as well. So that was the presence of evil, and that was something which you had to fear. And they basically developed ways of, if they thought that was caused by magic, what method do we have to use to turn this magic away, or to absorb it, or to trap it, or to put it back on whoever gave it to us?
Yeah.
These various methods of counter witchcraft got developed, and not just developed in this country. I mean, certainly witch bottles are uniquely English, and then spread to America, and then went to other countries a little bit as well, but not so much in Europe. But the other things like shoes, cats, horse skulls, they're all over Europe, all over America and Australia. Not so much horse skulls, but certainly a lot of them did get to Australia. and the marks, certainly the daisy wheel marks and the circles, that is totally pan-European, but some of the sort of Marian marks, that the VVs and the M's, we get a few of those in Europe, but not so much. That's largely English, and also we get them in Australia and America, which is obviously where the English went to.
Colonies, yeah.
Amongst lots of other nations, of course. Yeah, so it's fascinating. But back to the point, though, when modern people who've had a modern education and are taught not to believe in superstitions, etc., when they find these things in their homes, it's like a little trap door has flipped open.
Yeah.
The fear of the supernatural, the sense of superstition, the sort of awareness of magic being around you. Suddenly someone switched it on, where they've managed to keep it switched off most of the time. And so a lot of these people, they get really freaked out basically when they find these objects in their homes, and they think that if they move them, or if they unsettle them or disturb them, maybe whatever these people were trying to protect themselves from is going to get them.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? It's like it's hardwired into the DNA of us, isn't it?
Dan,
Absolutely.
I've got a question.
Yeah, sorry,
Can I put it on?
sorry, Viv. Oh, Terry, it may be a bit macabre. What about babies found in walls? I heard it was something about protection of the pure soul.
Okay, well, I'm glad to report that I haven't found any babies.
That's good.
Good.
Always good.
Yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, don't get me wrong. Obviously, murders happen, and people do conceal deaths for various reasons. And I'm sure that there are buildings out there with dead humans of all ages in them. I mean, I remember there was one pub in Derbyshire somewhere where there was a human skull and crossbones found under the floor. And there was a pub in Birmingham where a child's preserved arm was recovered from a chimney. And we're not sure what happened there. We think it might have been a biological specimen or something like that, but that's very odd. So yeah, there are some really weird things that we find in buildings, but thankfully, children not so often, or never really. There is
that's good.
There is a legend from the island of Iona, which I'm sure you've heard about the priory there.
Yeah.
That when they founded the monastery there, one of the monks gave his life to be interred in the foundations, because it was like a sort of offering, if you like, to the spirit of place, to make it a secure foundation. And there certainly, in the Roman era, if you get back a lot further than the period I normally study, there certainly are offerings of humans to town ditches, for example, and cities and things like that. So certainly in the era that I'm talking about, which the finds I normally deal with, generally speaking, go back to about the 14th century, but then I come right up to the present day.
No, it's interesting. As I said, a friend of mine, he had a house in Enfield that was sort of early Victorian, and I remember he was removing the half of the fire, and underneath it he found buried a cloth, a very old cloth. It was rotten, really. And as he opened it, there were a tiny pair of shoes in it, and like a little shirt, like Victorian. He thinks it was. So I'm assuming, I think it's something to do with the death of the child or something. They used to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, basically. I mean, concealed shoes is one of the most common types of objects that we find rather. Usually they're single shoes, not pairs, and usually they're really, really well worn. So when you find, for example, a pair of child's shoes that are in quite good condition, that's probably to do with infant mortality. Like a little preserving the last thing that the child was wearing or something like that.
Oh,
But then we also get sometimes it's possible that sometimes shoes are also to do with fertility, because there was a lot of beliefs that if a woman was struggling to become pregnant, for example, desperately wanted a child, sometimes they could take the shoes of a little child that was newly born, that kind of thing, to bring in some fertility into the house. And it was kind of trying to encourage the spirit of fertility into the house almost. So there's an awful lot of beliefs and practices around fertility, but when it's a single shoe, or a lot of single shoes, a lot of odd shoes, or I say odd, I mean, when they were made in the past, they weren't made to be left or right footed, but obviously they would take the shape of a left or a right foot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
oh yeah.
But yeah, so generally speaking, when it's for protection purposes, the idea is that shoes, because they were quite expensive, you'd wear them as long as you could, and you'd have them repaired and repaired and repaired until eventually they wouldn't really fit anybody else or suit anybody else, because it had been formed around your bunions and your wonky feet.
And that's it.
And so this is where the Cinderella myth comes from. The fact that you've got this slipper that only fits the one person and everything. There's lots of ideas about shoes, but basically you end up with this unique object that's uniquely yours, and you're only going to get rid of it when you absolutely can't fix it anymore. And then you can use it essentially as a decoy. So if you put that in your wall, or put it under your floor, or you put it on a little ledge up inside your fireplace, any evil that might be trying to come and get you, that's traveling down the fireplace, coming to try and attack you, might be fooled into thinking it's found you when it finds the shoe, and then attack it instead of you. And that's that kind of thinking that's behind an awful lot of this kind of magical house protection material, which obviously I talk about in my book and in my lectures.
Yeah. I got a question for you, Brian, and I'm itching to ask you. I went into a very small chapel in Kings Lynn, which is known as Red Mount, and in the upstairs of the chapel there is some very old graffiti. Don't know how old this graffiti is, but what it is, it shows there's a pencil drawing. It's very, very old. It's not recent years, and it shows Castle Rising, which is the other side of Kings Lynn. But it also, in that graffiti drawing, it had pictures of soldiers, and it also showed, for some reason, it looked out of place. It looked like what seemed to be a Templar type cross. Now, my question to you is, have you seen very old graffiti in strange places, and what did they depict, and do you have any inkling of why it might have been there?
Well, specifically the one that you've seen, or just generally speaking?
Generally speaking, does anything like that come to mind? I mean, I know we're talking about strange objects, but I'm sort of branding this in that category, because I find that very strange. Why would a castle, the other side of the town, be depicted on that wall, and why the soldiers? I don't know if they were held prisoner there or something like that at that point, or whether they were just passing by. I don't know, but.
Well, there is a kind of resonance with soldiers and people going off to war. They often would want a depiction or something of themselves in the church, whether it be their initials or an outline of a foot, an outline of their own shoe, or a hand outline or something like that before they go off to war, that kind of thing. And I think that what's going on there is that they're hoping that some of the sort of sanctity of the place will resonate through their own sort of sympathetic magic, through their own handprint or their own footprint into their lives, to maybe protect them when they're out on the battlefield. And certainly in the southeast, in your sort of neck of the woods, there's an awful lot of ship graffiti. And I think that's a similar sort of thing, where you've got sailors and ship's captains, people who work on ships, sort of doing a picture of the ship that they will be sailing in, hoping that some of the sort of sanctity of the holiness, if you like, will be transferred through that image, sort of through sympathetic magic, to maybe keep them safe on their voyages. And I'm sure you know how superstitious people who go on the sea are in particular. But yeah, we find this kind of link quite a lot. I mean, some graffiti is doodles. It's people who've got a bit too much time on their hands. They've got the time and the opportunity to do some drawing, and then there's something that's special to them, which we maybe will never know what that means, and they're taking the time to carve that. But other times it's a lot more personal, and the things that we find an awful lot of are things like I was saying, like shoe outlines. We're talking about concealed shoes, but quite often we find these shoe outlines on stone benches. and often in the lead on church roofs as well. And it seems like people were kind of, like I say, trying to draw some of this power, if you like, some of this sacred power from the building into their own journeys in life. Some people think that they're to do with pilgrimages as well, so that when people would go on a pilgrimage somewhere, they might do a shoe outline there, like almost like a connection with the place that they made the pilgrimage to. So like Canterbury, which again is not terribly far from you guys, Canterbury Cathedral, the cloisters there, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shoe outlines.
Wow.
Some with initial dates inside, some without. But then, you know, that same practice, even around near to where I live, you know, in Worcestershire, there's a little church called Breeden Church, and that's not a pilgrimage route or anything, but, you know, in the church porch there on the stone bench, there are several shoe outlines. And it's people having this connection with the place and wanting
It's
to.
amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know there's a
Why-
church somewhere in Hertfordshire, and there's an old Latin graffiti in it, and apparently it proclaims that a woman who lived in a village called Anne is quite loose,
Ooh.
Oh dear.
which
That's good.
tickled me. It was even in those days, you know, they were sort of name calling. I found it
It's
quite,
almost
it tickled
kind
me.
of thought, that one, isn't it? Yeah. But
Brilliant.
yeah, you can get all sorts of things. I mean, I'm sure you've seen there's an English medieval graffiti project where people are sort of surveying various churches and things looking for graffiti, and you know, and this subject, people have been doing this for a lot longer than that new body has existed, but they've kind of made it a bit more popular, and you know, they find things like music scores carved into stone. You know?
Wow.
And sometimes it'll be someone from a foreign country that's visiting England in the 15th century or something who just wants to say, I was here, you know,
And
because
that's the way of doing it.
there's from so far away, you know. But then other times, and this is the funny thing, you know, in churches, you get a lot of these protection marks in churches, and you would think, well, surely it's protected already by the Spirit
Yeah.
of God and all the images of Christ and the saints and stuff all over the place. But I think that again, you know, people didn't think it was completely infallible. You know, they felt that they could bring their own protection to the place as well.
Yeah.
And certainly some tombs, you know, I think people wondered, is the spirit of this person vulnerable to evil? And so they put extra protection marks on it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's intriguing, isn't it? It's really interesting, isn't it? Subject matter. So, what would you say are amongst the oddest or weirdest things that you've come across that have been buried on properties or hidden in properties? Brian?
It's probably the ones that make people go ooh the most as well are usually the sort of ones that appear to be curses or appear to be dark magic of some kind. So there's one that was found in sort of it's a suburb of Greater Manchester. Yeah, I'm just trying to remember the name of the place. It's not coming to me right now, but it might come to me in a minute. Basically, Prestwich, that's it. And basically, there's a church there, and next to the church is a really old pub, 17th century. And in the basement of the pub, someone worked out that there was essentially a false wall. And they took the false wall down and discovered behind it a dried cat, a pile of what was described as vegetable matter, and a bag with 3 carved figures inside it. And this had been carefully bricked up rather than just disposed of. Someone definitely wanted it to stay there and walled it up. And to me, what that looks like, the vegetable matter to me is someone collecting herbs and roots. You know, the dried cat is a sacrificial cat, and the figures are whoever this magic is aimed at. You know, and so that's quite remarkable. For someone to have gathered together all that stuff, to have done it in this basement, which is of course adjacent to a burial ground in a church, and then to feel the need to actually brick it up and to manage to keep that sort of secret, it's quite amazing. And then I've got some friends who work in the Herefordshire Museum Service, and they've got quite a good collection of curses there that have been found in the city of Hereford and the environment, you know, around over the years. One of which is a tiny little coffin that was nailed to behind some panelling. Another one was essentially a little rag doll that was made of a short piece of wood with a very crude cloth head, was stuffed with rags. But inside the skirt of the rag doll was a piece of paper that curled around the skirt perfectly, which had a curse on a local girl in it. And and that was found again behind some panelling in the city centre. That was a Victorian one. And then from Dimmock in Gloucestershire, there's one that's quite famous because it was featured in Ralph Merrifield's book as well. It's just referred to as the Dimmock Curse, and inside the main sort of manor house there, they found behind an old wardrobe, I think, which was kind of panelled walls stretching out from there. They found a little square lead curse, very similar to the Roman lead curses, but this one was definitely 17th century. And it was a curse on a local girl called Sarah Ellis. And there is folklore that she was then later buried at a crossroads. So this curse was apparently, effective on her. But the writing on the tablet is mirror writing, and then there's some language that's clearly been copied from one of these grimoires that was in popular circulation in the 17th century as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so things like that are pretty cool, aren't they?
It's fascinating.
Very cool.
I say pretty cool. Not cool for the people who have been cursed, obviously.
No.
Very interesting for us to look at.
They're amazing artifacts to find. And just to hold something like that in your hands, something of that age and that significant, it must be just mind-blowing.
It's very amazing. See, that one was held by the Gloucester Folk Museum for a long time, which I think is now just called Gloucester Folk. I think they've rebranded the museum. But yeah, I was going to take it and put it into an exhibition for a while, and so I actually had it in my house for about 3 weeks while we were putting that exhibition together. So things like that are pretty amazing to
That is amazing.
But it's back there again now. But yeah, it's an incredible artifact. Never seen there are a couple of others like that from around the country. There's one from Yorkshire as well. They're all detailed in my book, and yeah.
Yes, your book. What is your book called, and where can we get a copy of your book?
Okay, it's called Magical House Protection: The Archaeology of Counter Witchcraft. It was first published in hardback in 2019, and it's been in paperback since the beginning of 2021. And you can order it from my website, which is hard to spell, which I hope you might put on the screen or something.
I'm going to put that on the screen.
Yes,
go for it.
Yeah. It's called apatropios.co.uk, which no one can spell or say, but hopefully you'll be able to show them it later on. But you can also if you just Google my name, Brian Hoggard, on any sort of book search engine, it should just
Come up.
Yeah, it's available on all good bookshops, of course. But yeah,
all reputable book dealers.
Yeah, but if you get it from my website, I'll sign it before I send it off. If that.
Excellent.
What's your website, Brian?
It's apatropios.co.uk. It's
right. Okay. Yeah, I'll get that. I'll put that in the comments now. I shall find that as we speak. Cool.
So, what is your most recent or the most recent thing that you're dealing with? Is there anything you're dealing with at the moment, or?
Well, what happens usually is that people send me a report about something that's already been dealt with. Usually, so I'm not actually working actively on a site right now. Someone has just got in touch with me to say they're about to do some work on a building in Herefordshire, and would I come and have a look to help them see if there's any marks in there, that kind of thing. But I did get a report recently of a horse skull found underneath a 1960s house in Manchester, which is quite interesting because that sort of practice normally sort of, I'm not going to say it's stopped, but I'd say that I don't normally get reports of that from earlier than the 1930s. So this is really, really late example. Because, you think about a horse skull, where do you get one from, and how do you remove it from the horse, and how do you remove it from the head of the horse, and how do you then sneak it across an urban area and hide it beneath a house that's being built? There's all those questions. Obviously, as we go back in time to an era before motor vehicles were the norm, you can see there's probably quite a lot of opportunities to get a horse skull, in the local knacker's yard.
Yeah.
But as motorized transport became the norm, that those opportunities disappeared with it. So to get one from the 1960s, that's really unusual.
It strikes me as odd that people use that. I mean, that would be the type of magic that I thought would have fell by the way, that people wouldn't be dealing with in nowadays. It would have been lost in the mist of time, as it were, or little artifacts of it written down in a book somewhere. But it's quite odd, isn't it? Is there any particular reason for the horse heads? Or was that just a form of protection, or was there anything significant with the horse heads?
Well, it seems to be for protection, because we find them in places that associate them with protection. So quite often they're associated with the hearth. There's a really good American example where a horse skull was found which had a piece of paper rolled up in its eye socket, listing the people who lived in the house. So that clearly seems to relate to it being like a charm for protection, you know. But yeah, sometimes there, like in Sweden, there was one found where there were horse skulls at every corner of the building facing out, and so you get them found in contexts like this that clearly suggest they were used for protection. And there's another example. Again, this is one that Ralph Merrifield. Well, I first saw it in Ralph Merrifield's book, but he actually got it from Enid Porter's Folklore of Cambridgeshire, which you might have seen. And basically, she describes a late 19th century example of some builders who were building a chapel. This was a sort of Methodist chapel somewhere in Norfolk. It might have been Norfolk, or is it Cambridgeshire? I think it might have been right on the border somewhere. Somewhere. Do they border? They do border, don't they?
Yes.
But anyway, it's right on the border somewhere. And and basically, the builder had sent the builder's sort of lad, the sort of little helper lad, off to the knacker's yard to get a horse's head. And then they brought it back to this foundation ceremony that they were doing, and they put the horse's head in the foundation ditch. They opened a bottle of beer, poured some beer over it, and then they all drank what was left of the beer. And they said very clearly that the purpose of doing this was to keep evil and witchcraft away. And so clearly there's this strong belief, because some of the horse skulls that we find definitely date back to the 14th century, and these are separated from a horse and concealed deliberately under the building. And and there's that same practice happening again.
Yeah. It's amazing. I would have assumed that those type of actions would have been lost in the midst of time, but clearly not. They're still prevalent today in some instances. It's a really interesting subject. So, Viv, have we got any more questions?
Nothing's come up as much yet. People are saying great lives, and they're really they're finding it very interesting. I think we might be blowing their minds with all of this.
It is very, very interesting.
But Lois is saying how it's an amazing show for her, and people are actually learning something from Brian.
Good,
I think
excellent. Now there was I can't remember how long ago it was. Probably it might have been 5 or 6 years, maybe longer than that. Actually, probably about 10 years ago now. There was a cottage that was unearthed in Pendle Hill, or around that area, and they assumed that it was a witch's cottage. Don't hear that much about it. I only heard about it in the news for maybe a year, and then all of a sudden it was excavated. They sort of found it was hidden under earth.
I remember the one.
I wonder if you knew anything about that at all, or.
Yeah, it was essentially it's a ruined cottage on Pendle Hill that I think there was an American guy who sort of got some funding to do some archaeological research in it. He was very interested in obviously the Pendle Witch story, and I think when they were excavating it, they found the remains of a cat in one of the rooms.
Yeah.
And I think what it is that from that, because I was contacted about the dried cat, I'm pretty sure, and obviously the dried cat typically is a counter witchcraft thing. It's something that people would do to protect their house essentially from, it's not just counter witchcraft. I mean, when people did these practices, it's any kind of evil. It doesn't have to just be witchcraft. They were scared of many things. It wasn't just witches. And of course, people were, if you to use modern judgment, were practicing witchcraft by putting these things in their house in the first place. Do you know what I mean? So like, who's the heretic?
Yeah.
But essentially, I think the person inferred that because there was a dried cat in the house, that meant it was a witch's cottage, and then they released that as a press release to some newspaper who decided that yes, this is a witch's cottage. But actually, finding a dried cat in a building doesn't make it a witch's cottage.
Wouldn't be unusual anyway, would it? I guess.
Well, it's a form of protection for the house. It doesn't tell you anything necessarily about the people in the house, other than they thought it was a form of protection for the house. So to say it was a witch's cottage, who knows?
Yeah.
I'm not. You can't categorically say it's not true, but you can't categorically say it is true for sure. So
I think it was newspaper speak.
I've got a question. I've got
Go
a
on then.
question. So, Brian, we've talked about mainly churches, houses. What is the weirdest thing that you know of, or you've seen yourself, that has been found in an old alehouse or pub, as we call them today? What is the most shocking and surprising that you wouldn't have thought, and why was it there?
Well, where do I begin? Pubs. I haven't actually narrowed it down to just a category of pubs, but I can think of a few. And I did mention earlier to you about the human skull and crossbones found beneath the pub, which I think was in Derby. But then there are other things. I mean, like, pubs have pretty much had every kind of object you can imagine in them as well. So, like, when I've got all these different chapters in my book about marks, cats, horse skulls, witch bottles, you name it, they've all been found in pubs, amongst other places. But recently, there was one reported to me from up in the northeast. I think it was in Yorkshire, in East Yorkshire. There was a pub where they were doing some renovating and they were pulling some plaster off the wall. And behind the plaster there was a brass or copper plaque, which looks like it had a St. Bridget's cross on it. So, and St. Bridget, obviously people used to use the St. Bridget's cross, and they still do, for protection. They'll make one in the year and it can be a charm you can leave against someone's door. And obviously St. Bridget, a lot of people think that essentially that was actually an ancient pagan goddess that became Christianized. And this cross is actually all part of that. And it's kind of like a female solar deity in a way, a fire deity. But yeah, so I thought it was really interesting that in this pub, which was a 17th century pub, someone's taken the time to engrave what looks like a St. Bridget's cross and conceal it behind plaster. So that's a lot of work to go to,
Yeah,
isn't it just?
Yeah. And I thought that was really cool, basically.
That is cool.
It is cool.
I'm guessing that would have been quite expensive at the time as well for an artifact.
Yeah, it'd be pretty expensive now, isn't it? Really, if you were to try and commission someone to make yourself a copper plaque that you could then hide behind the wall.
Exactly.
It's a waste.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of effort, isn't it? It's a huge amount of effort.
There's a question in the chat.
I saw that. So Lois asks, "What's your dream location?"
My dream,
by the way.
Pardon? Oh, basically, you stick me in a 16th century or 17th century timber framed building of some kind, and leave me there with a torch and a camera, and I'll quite happily while away the day.
Find something.
I'm guessing those marks would be significant in any property, would they? You'd find any sort of property from that period would have those marks.
Absolutely. But the reason I mentioned like a 17th century hall or something is because I admire the architecture as well. So I'd be like, wow, look at all this.
Yeah.
I've got a little endoscope device as well that you can poke into holes in the walls as well. So if there's a little cavity somewhere, I can see inside it as well. So I find that pretty exciting.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's superb. And have you seen stuff hidden in those little places, nooks and crannies with the endoscope?
I've only had that particular device for a little while, but I haven't found anything with it yet. Okay, but I live in hope because I have been taken to many sites where things have been found in walls, usually sort of during demolitions or renovations, and so it's just a matter of time until I find some magical results with that. Yeah.
Perfect, fantastic.
I've got another question.
Go on.
I've got a question. So it's not a strange object found in a building per se. It's more like out in the fields. So bear with me with this question. The chalk horses and the naked man that you see in the cliffs, and there's a few up and down the country. Do you think that there might be something or clues in churches or places that you've seen that might have what's the word I'm looking for? Is there any significance? Is there any connection between what you've seen and those things out on the hills?
I wouldn't say there's like a really, really direct one, but certainly one of the issues with those chalk figures, which is really interesting, is that they vary in date so much. Yeah. So so there are quite a few examples that are Victorian or 20th century, that people did as like a landmark. Some wealthy landowner said, "Oh, let's do a big horse like that ancient one we saw somewhere else." Then you've got somewhere like the Uffington White Horse in Oxfordshire, which is pre-Christian. It's an Iron Age horse or dragon, depending on who you're talking to about that subject. And then you've got the Long Man of Wilmington, which is the guy with the two big staffs that divide it. And the Cerne Abbas giant with the massive winky. Well, and they've been doing quite a bit of research on him lately. And I don't know if you saw that program that was on TV recently, where they found out that I think that he dated to about the 800s or something like that.
Something like,
Because I think there were people who thought it might be like a Civil War sort of era figure, and there were people who thought it might be like a prehistoric figure, and it ended up being slap bang in the middle. And so that one, the saint who's got the massive, the ginormous phallus, they reckon that he might have been actually associated with a legend of a saint from that area, which puzzles me slightly because I'm not familiar with saints normally exposing their bits and pieces. So far, in terms of the subject that I study, I wouldn't say there's been a particular connection with the carved figures and what I study. But except that, you could argue that with the horse skulls and the horse figures, there might be a connection there, because there are ancient beliefs about the horse, which appear to be at work with these horse skulls as well. So, you could say there's a connection in terms of the beliefs about the horses. So in that respect, there's probably a connection. But we're talking about different time periods mostly. But still the same subject and possibly some beliefs that are connected.
Have you found any clues to the missing Templar treasure? Have you found anything buried or scratched or graffiti wise in churches, or has there been anything that you could have said, "Oh, this looks like Templar markings or something"? Have you seen anything strange like that?
Well, in terms of Templar treasure, no. That's one of the great mysteries of the medieval period, is what happened to that. That's not something that I'm thinking about when I'm out there looking for my marks and stuff like that.
You don't know. You got that probe now, so you never know.
Well, who knows? But yeah, I think there is a place up in Scotland actually that's reputed to have possibly been the place where that happened. Which I'm just trying to think of the name of the place. Aber something. But yeah, anyway, there's a place where connected with Robert Kirk, the ancient beliefs about fairies and stuff like that. Do you know about have you heard of Robert Kirk before?
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard of Robert Kirk. Yes.
Yeah, he was people thought that he gave away too many secrets about the fairy, and they effectively locked his spirit inside a tree. But that area, that place there, I believe that some people think that the Templar treasure was there. But there is probably about 100 places where people think that the Templar treasure was placed. Certainly, one thing that crops up in people who study medieval graffiti more broadly is they'll find crosses that resemble that are similar to the Templar crosses. But that type of cross wasn't just used by the Templars. So you get people sort of coming up with all sorts of ideas about, was this someone who was related to the Templars, or was there some connection with the Templars? But yeah, it does. The cross, what they call the Templar cross, does crop up quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It has lots of misconceptions and legends around that, tucked around that.
Yeah, the Templars were a real bunch of knights. They existed in England. They had farms and preceptories throughout England and Scotland and Wales, and then of course they were abolished by the Pope. And so they fled to the countries where they weren't abolished, which was Portugal and Scotland, and there's lots and lots of myths and legends about them. That's not what I'm looking for when I'm out and about doing my research, but certainly people in graffiti do come across marks and inscriptions which they would say are connected with the Templars.
I find it interesting that the word fays come up. Have you ever found anything that could be representative of protection against fairies, or is there anything out there that artifacts that people would have used to protect themselves against the fae? Or
Absolutely. I mean, basically, all of the things that I've been talking to you about, they're not specifically counter witchcraft. They counter anything that could cause you harm via supernatural
Right.
means. And and certainly in the south, where you've got very strong sort of witchcraft fairy beliefs, then it was equally relevant there. I mean, one of the things that obviously people used to think were effective against witches and fairies was iron.
Yes.
And so quite often you get these really massive sort of cast iron firebacks, in the fireplaces, and you'll get sort of bent pins and nails sometimes just popping up under the floor where there's no real need for them to be, that kind of thing. So, so yeah, all of these things, like horseshoes, for example, nailed up on a door or a wall, those are also, we're talking about not just good luck, but we're talking about the properties of iron at warding off evil. So, and also warding off the danger of the fairy. I mean, that, well, I'm sure you're aware that, like, one of the things that reinforced people's beliefs in the fairy is that when they came across a prehistoric burial mound, which at the time they didn't know were prehistoric burial mounds, they thought these were fairy hills. And then, of course, you could find in that vicinity little tiny arrowheads, which they thought were the arrowheads of the fairy, which actually are prehistoric flint arrowheads. But these all sort of backed up the idea that there was these fairies in the vicinity. And then and people would often include those artifacts in the walls of their houses as well. So there's this idea of thunderstones. Have you heard of that idea before?
Not thunderstones. No, I've not heard of that one.
Sometimes they would think that where lightning struck the ground, that's how these little artifacts were created, essentially. And so essentially, if you took one of these artifacts and put it in your wall, then you would protect yourself from lightning, because lightning never strikes the same place twice.
Twice.
Yeah. So they're called thunderstones.
Fantastic.
And so you've got this mixture of sort of fairy belief and sort of weather lore and weather belief, because it's basically a lack of science, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Something fills that void, doesn't it?
Yeah, if you don't know what causes this incredible, dangerous bolt from the sky, you start to have beliefs about it. I mean, if I hadn't been taught what it was, I don't think I'd know.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got a question. Have you ever looked at standing stones, and have you ever been able to, or have you ever been lucky enough to be able to be given permission to just have a look around the standing stones to see if there was anything buried or for any significance of them? And if you have, what did you find, or what are your thoughts about the standing stone thing? Because I find them weird. I do find them weird. Well,
they're very ancient. Obviously, it's not my period. I am fascinated by prehistoric monuments. I have written about them before. My first book was about a place called Breedon Hill in Worcestershire.
Thank you.
It has quite a lot of stone monuments which are ancient.
Yeah.
And there are lots of beliefs around them. But your average standing stone circle would be a scheduled ancient monument. So it's actually against the law for me to dig anywhere near one of those.
Yeah.
Because of
to
try. But it's they are incredible, and the most sort of theories that people come up with about them seem to make the most sense to do with observation of the sky. These are the ones that seem to be the most logical, shall we say, and certainly some of them definitely seem to have alignments to do with sunrise and sunset. Sometimes there's a kind of connection with the moon as well. Sometimes there's a connection with constellations as well.
Some celestial, wasn't it?
There is a monolith in an actual graveyard, and I think it's up past Derby Way somewhere. It's coming up north that way, and I happened to see that, and I thought that was very odd to have something like that in a graveyard, something as old as that. Why would a church do something like that? Why would you build your church on it? Basically, I just couldn't fathom it. I just thought it was weird.
It's actually surprisingly common for churches to be built on prehistoric sacred sites. Yeah. Because there was, I can't remember which one it was, but there was an edict by a pope sometime in what we would call the Saxon era. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but anyway, the idea was that this edict was put forth that you should co-opt pagan sites when you're building churches, because the pagan people who were living in these areas, which is basically anyone before Christianity came along, would want to go to these sites to have their festivals or worship or whatever. And so if you erect a Christian monument on that site, then you can gradually convert them to Christianity.
Yeah.
I think the site you're probably thinking of is called Rudston, which is, there's a thing called the Rudston monolith, and it's like one of the tallest standing stones in the country, and it's right in the middle of
massive.
it's a bit wonky, and it's right in the middle of a churchyard. And so if you look into, I mean, you're interested in your churchyard history and stuff. If you find a churchyard that's circular and ancient, if it looks like a really, really ancient churchyard and it's circular, quite often that is a sign that it was built on a prehistoric sacred site as well, because prehistoric sacred sites generally were more circular, and whereas later on when the church builds like a fresh site, they would tend to build their churchyards in a square. So, so you've got like clues like that it's not always the rule, but quite often it's correct, so
it's the starting point. It's very, I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
No, I didn't know that either.
So Terry's got a question here.
Yes,
I think
I was
William
going to put that
answered
up.
for him. Oh, I'll just put that. There you go. What is the correct way to hang a horseshoe, walking forward or backwards?
The correct answer is there is no correct way to hang a horseshoe, forwards or backwards, but in some areas they will tell you absolutely and threaten you with violence if you disagree that it should be one way, and then you go to another place and they'll tell you exactly the opposite. So it really is different depending on who you ask and where.
I remember my father telling me that it was always up, so your luck doesn't run out. Obviously,
what way is
has significance where you come from.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just local variation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like really for me, I always think that with horseshoes, because I'm obsessed with horse skulls and I think about them a lot. I've got a horse skull above me just right now behind there. But yeah, I think that the horses and horseshoes actually live on a place where they rear horses as well. But yeah, so I think that the connection with horses, there's something about beliefs about horses and iron, and those two things.
I was going to say, is it more to do with the iron?
It's a mixture.
But then if you've got horses' skulls that are buried as well for protection, then it's got to be. They both have got to be significant, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, for example, with horse skulls, right? There was an example from Herefordshire where beneath the floorboards of a pub in a place called Staunton on Wye, they found 24 horse skulls screwed to the underside of the.
24.
Yeah, and when people asked what was the purpose of it, they said, well, it made the dancing sound better, it made the music sound better, and they tried to give an acoustic reason for it. But actually, that's not. It's not very plausible, is it? And and the thing is, we do know there are many buildings where it's clearly horse skulls that have been buried in earth, for example, but they couldn't be resonating in an acoustic manner. And because they found that one with the eye socket with the list of names of people who lived in the house and everything. And it seems like there's basically when people did these things, if they're discovered, you need to give a plausible reason for why they're all there, don't you? And the plausible reason is it makes the music sound better. But why they didn't just use clay pots, why they didn't sort of create some other
there are lots of other things.
Exactly, but instead, let's go and use lots of horse skulls. Yeah,
well, it's the first thing you go to, isn't it? Horse skulls, if you want,
every time
resonance in a building,
a venue or whatever, I've always thought I must bring a horse skull with me to make this better.
Well, I've got here. It's really weird what people collect now. I've got a skull of a bird that I picked up on a beach. And I'll actually show you because I'm quite proud of them.
Pretty cool artifact, to be fair.
I've got chicken feet, which I'm decorating, which I just thought
you could be a doctor with those.
Rather than give it to the dog, I decorate it. So I suppose people's throughout history, they would pick up these weird and wonderful things and think, oh, I'll have that as a good luck charm or something. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, things like chicken's feet. You think about. If you're like young and you're suddenly finding a feeling for magic and everything, and you find these unusual objects, and you feel like you're creating these magical objects almost, these things that they're connected with mortality and death, and they could bring things from the other side or whatever, or harness energies from somewhere else. And you've got these kind of ideas that are kind of innate to humans who are curious about magic and want to. You see things like that, charms with animal bones and everything. You find them in shamanic cultures all over the world. Tribal cultures anywhere, and I'm sure it would have been just the same in Britain. whether it be in the Saxon era or earlier, you would find people basically harnessing what they're finding in nature around them and creating charms and magical devices, or what they believe to be magical devices, out of them. But yeah, there's certain things that seem to have lingered, like the horse skulls, the shoes, the witch bottles, etc. Witch bottles aren't an ancient practice, but the shoes and the horse skulls certainly do seem to be connected to that, and then the daisy wheels as well.
I think one of the things that I find most interesting is a lot of these artifacts and a lot of the significance of them to people in this country is also significant to people in other parts of the world, but dating back to sort of pre-dawn of time, as it were, dating back to sort of prehistory, where they never had that, or allegedly they never had that sort of connection that the world has today. Yet you still find something might not be, it runs parallel, might not necessarily be exactly the same, but it kind of replicates the effect that an artifact they use, say, I don't know, Papua New Guinea, you could find used here for the same significance, maybe a different artifact, but the same principle.
Yeah, you're sort of talking about sort of cultural resonances between humans across the world, and it's like what we refer to as shamanism now, for example, appears to be the form of magical belief that humans develop at some stage in their evolution, wherever they are in the world. And you could say that Native American magic is very similar, or is shamanism, and yet you've got the shamans of northern Siberia, and you've got various cultures across Africa and Polynesia and Asia that all have similarities, in terms of their sort of village societies and beliefs and practices, and it seems like humans just end up having these beliefs and creating things out of the environment around them which are similar.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
It's very cool.
I've got a question. Have you ever been called, let's say, to a property, house, pub, whatever, to find human remains, but then find that you've had to call the police? Has that ever happened yet? And if it did, when the police come and do their thing, are you able to go back to the bones then, or take back whatever it is? If they say, oh no, it's ancient, get on with it, sort of thing. Have you ever experienced that yet, where you found something that strange that you've had to call the authorities? Or does that not happen?
Not personally, no. I mean, I think that usually when people call me, it's because they found something they think is specifically my area of expertise. And it's rare that it happens at the same time as someone is calling in someone to investigate human bones that have been found. But there is one example from a place called Lawton or Lufton, which is near to Milton Keynes, or part of that sort of conurbation, where when they were widening a railway line, they had to excavate a cemetery. And one of the things they found in one of the coffins was this coffin of a young man. And they found what's called an 18th century steeple bottle, which is quite tall. It's about this tall, and it's basically quite wide at the base and goes to a very slender sort of top. And basically that bottle was filled with urine and bent pins and nails, and the cork in the top was also stuck with bent pins and nails. And that burial had to be excavated, all under supervision of the authorities, obviously, because when you excavate a cemetery, it has to be done with all the correct permissions, etc.
Yeah.
But yeah, that particular bottle, that's what you would normally consider to be a counter witchcraft bottle that had been snuck into someone's coffin.
Wow.
And whether they thought that this young man was the witch or wizard, or whether they thought that he had been harmed by a witch or wizard and they were trying to continue some protection for him, we're not sure. But yeah, certainly very, very fascinating, isn't it?
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very cool. Yeah.
Brilliant. Right.
Yeah, and then there was a full report on that one. Yeah.
No, it's great. Brian, we've come to the end of gone over, I'm afraid. Sorry.
We've gone over, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on here this evening. We really appreciate it. It's very kind of you. And we'll ask you back at a later date if that's possible at some point.
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to. And thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Brian.
And if anybody would like Brian's book before we go, the link is up on the website. Go and check it out. Go and look at his Facebook. I personally, his email website even. I'm personally enthralled. I'm getting a book. I don't care what
I'm buying
anybody
it from
says.
Brian's website. Get Brian to sign it for me.
Please do.
That'd be great. So no, that's brilliant. Thanks again, Brian. It's really,
No,
really
you're
kind of you.
Brian, stay where you are. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back next Wednesday at 8:00 on Simply Spooky. We hope that you can join us then. Dan, I hope you're well enough with your leg and everything. Don't do anything silly in the week, will you?
I wish I could, but I can't.
Just stay where you. Don't move on it. Just stay where you are. Thank you for
Thanks,
everyone in the
everybody, for
chat.
tuning
Thank you
in.
for your questions.
Thank
And
you.
we'll say good night. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Good night, everybody. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Bye.